Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 117 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Today I'm speaking with Stuart Reid. Stuart is a graduate of Dartmouth College and has worked at Foreign Affairs magazine for the past 15 years, where he is now an executive editor. He has also written for The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Bloomberg Businessweek, Politico magazine, Slate, and other publications. I invited Stuart onto the podcast to talk about his new book, The Lumumba Plot. It's a story I've wanted to explore in depth for a very long time, the very short and tragic career of the Republic of the Congo's first prime minister after gaining independence from Belgium in 1960. Patrice Lumumba served for just a few months before he was ousted from his position, arrested, tortured, and eventually executed. He was caught up in the international power struggle between the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Nations, and the Belgian government. After you listen to this episode, you can also download the prologue and first chapter of the Lumumba Plot for free. Just click the link in the show notes of this episode. But before we dive into this story, I want to ask you something. Are you an amateur military historian like me? Has this podcast rekindled your interest in Eastern Europe and the Cold War? Maybe you're finally getting into reenacting and living history, just like you've always said you would. If so, you should check out the incredible collection of surplus military goods at Krashiki.com. Krus himself scours the continent for the best uniforms and field equipment available and delivers them right to your door. He's got almost anything you can imagine and many things you haven't. Uniforms from East Germany, the Soviet Union, and modern-day Bulgaria, Poland, and Russia are all available. Rucksacks, mess kits, and load-bearing gear are also up on the site right now. The inventory is constantly changing, so you never know what kind of gems you might stumble on, all at very affordable prices. Find it all at Krashiki.com. That's KRUSCHIKI.com. And use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 for 10% off your order. Stuart, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. I was somewhat familiar with this story before, and I've posted about it on my Instagram page, a very brief summary, of course, but I learned so much that I never knew reading your book. So I was really happy for the chance to learn so much of it from you and then to discuss the story with you and share it with the listeners as well.
Yeah, well, I learned a lot writing it too. I mean, this was a crisis that was front page news at the time, but it later became largely forgotten as the Cold War went on.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. It happened so many places. And your book is it's so incredibly in depth. It honestly feels like a day by day and sometimes like hour by hour testimonial of his very short career at the top there in the Congo. I was amazed at the level of detail that you were able to dig up.
Yeah, well, I hope it wasn't too much detail, but I really did feel that the goal was to just plunge the reader into events and experience them as people who were involved at the time were experiencing them, and understand all the complexities. But hopefully, I've tried to tell it in a way that has a narrative drive and keeps people turning the page.
Well, that's what it did for me, most definitely. And I felt like I kind of understood more or less, at least the motivations of everybody involved, which were obviously at cross purposes so often, but they were all, complex three-dimensional people and organizations and governments, and they all had their reasons for what they did, for better or worse, oftentimes for worse, in fact.
Yeah, I think that's how I saw it as well.
So what was it that led you to this story in the first place?
So I had the chance to travel to Congo, the country that is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in 2014. And that sent me down a rabbit hole of reading about the country's history. And the more I read, the more I realized that there was this great untold story here about the Congo's traumatic birth as an independent nation. And the events were tragic. Most of all, of course, the death of Patrice Lumumba, the country's prime minister. And then the characters also really drew me in. Lumumba himself, but also Mobutu, who we can talk about later, but who ended up becoming the country's long-term military dictator Larry Devlin, the CIA station chief at the time, Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the UN. All of these people were larger-than-life characters. They, allowed me to tell the story of the big story involving countries and nations and armies. But at the end of the day, it was also this very human story involving um, flawed people.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. They all had their, I guess, foibles and strengths and weaknesses and all that, and it felt like a lot of that was really on display throughout the book. So I know that you mentioned it was front page news at the time, but how difficult was it for you to really get to the heart of this story and to the level of detail that I mentioned earlier?
Well, fortunately, over the past 60 plus years, a lot of material has come out. So, the most important source for me, I would say, were declassified CIA cables that have been released. Some of them released by the State Department in a special historical volume. Others, that were part of the Church Committee investigation, which was a 1975 investigation into CIA wrongdoing. Documents from that have been slowly declassified. But then, some of the sources were, for instance, interviews with the children of people who were involved at the time, interviews I conducted. Also, sort of long forgotten memoirs written by Congolese politicians in the 60s and 70s. So, I had a real range of sources, largely archival documents, but also, academic texts and oral histories people had done. And by combining all these things, I was able to reconstruct the narrative.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, it certainly paid off in the end. I know it was years and years of work on your part. So, can you take us back to the beginning of Patrice's story then? Like, what was it like for him as a young boy growing up into the man that would ultimately become prime minister?
Yeah, so Patrice Lumumba, he was born in 1925 in a small village, and this was under the era of Belgian colonialism. So his youth was really defined, like almost everyone else in the colonies was, by the limits on what you could do under the sort of repressive Belgian administration. So the the real turning point in his life was he migrated to a city in his teens or 20s, and that was a journey that many African men across the continent were doing, flocking to these sort of regional centers. So the one he went to was Stanleyville, as it was known at the time, and there began his rise. He worked for the post office, so working for the Belgian administration in the post office as a postal clerk. He also joined all of these associations among other Congolese who were sort of literary minded and politically minded. But of course, overtly political activity was forbidden because at that point, the Belgians had this, in retrospect, insane idea that they could hold on to their colony in the Congo for decades. I mean, in 1955, there was a quote 30-year plan released. So the idea being that after 30 years in 1985, only then would Congo be ready to be an independent country.
Wow.
And the professor who released that plan actually got in trouble because that was seen as way too soon. So there was a real reluctance to accept reality on the part of the Belgian administration.
Yeah, yeah. Oddly enough, oftentimes it isn't up to the colonial power as to when the colony gains independence.
That's what the Belgian government learned belatedly.
Yes, unfortunately for them. Anyway, so you mentioned these associations. Did these turn into like overt political activity later on? Like, how did he become such a leading figure in the Congolese politics at the time?
Yeah, so these were, I would say, they were a good training ground for his political organization. They were not yet overtly political, but what happened was at the post office, Lumumba was caught embezzling money. He he stole money from the post office. That's undeniable. His excuse was that he had, run out of money. He had all these, had to pay for food for his children, and he was living as a quote unquote Europeanized Congolese man, so he had to, get good food and send his kids to the good school and have magazine subscriptions, etc. But he was caught stealing and thrown in jail and stayed in jail for about a year and wrote this a book manuscript there. And what's striking about that book manuscript looked at now is it's very mild. He was not calling for immediate independence and down with imperialism. He was making very gentle, modest suggestions about, reducing racial discrimination in this or that area. But after he was released from jail, he moved to the capital of Congo, which was known as Leopoldville then. It's now Kinshasa. And of all professions, he ended up as a beer promoter. And that was really when the politics for him started. That was 1957. And at that point, things moved very quickly and people started talking about independence. Lumumba got involved in various political circles, co-founded a political party, took trips to other African countries to organize with other nationalist leaders from elsewhere. So really what was striking to me was how quickly this happened. I mean, if you look at the Lumumba of 1956 and what he was writing, and then the Lumumba of 1958, it's a night and day.
Hmm. Okay. What was it that kind of set him apart from others? Did he have just like a raw talent or, drive, ambition, anything in particular that kind of led him to rise to the top as independence loomed?
What everyone who met him thought universally, opponents, supporters, was that he was incredibly charismatic. He just really had a way with words, and he mixed rational argumentation with rousing emotional words to great effect. And he was just a inspiring speaker. So that was part of it. He was also a very talented political organizer. He just had a real knack for hiring lots of people, getting pamphlets printed, and just endlessly energetic in organizing things. So those two things help. But what also set him apart was his political ideology. Specifically, many other politicians were, because Congo was so ethnically divided, there's so many different ethnic groups, many other politicians were arguing for this or that ethnic group as they would be the protector of. Lumumba came from a relatively small ethnic group, and he had also sort of ranged widely geographically across Congo. So he was nearly alone in calling for a unified, single, strong Congo, and that, it turned out, had wide appeal.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. I see. Yeah, I understand. There's like a large number of ethnic groups there, and there was, I guess we'll get into it later, but breakaway groups and that sort of thing as well. So it must have been tough to get everybody together. It wasn't like a uniparty or anything that he was trying to lead.
Yeah, and in fact, many people argued, well, the Congo is an artificial colony with borders drawn by people in Europe. Why should we all be part of the same country? But
Hmm.
Lumumba accepted that they were part of the same country and advocated a form of Congolese nationalism.
Okay. I see. And at what point did he come to the attention of the colonial government, of foreign governments, as either a future threat or a future, I guess, opportunity, I would say, but like an influential person?
Yeah, pretty late. I mean, it'd be hard to date it exactly, but certainly by 1959, let's say, he was a very popular leader. He was, in fact, thrown in prison in late 1959 for giving a political speech that was seen as inciting a riot. So he was very popular by that point. He had met with many high-level Belgian officials. And then in January 1960, he emerges as the hero of the Round Table. And the Round Table was this big meeting in Brussels, Belgium, where Congolese met with Belgians to figure out independence. Belgium had finally, belatedly accepted that it no longer could hold on to its colony, didn't want an anti-colonial war like the one that was going on in Algeria. So it very quickly realized it needed to offload its colony and had this conference where the details would be worked out. And Lumumba dominated that conference. It was certainly clear by the beginning of January 1960 that this was a man who would have a significant role.
Okay. Yeah, that certainly makes sense. And what about Mobutu that you mentioned earlier? Where was he at this time anyway?
Yeah, so he's a fascinating character. And for people who have heard of Mobutu, the Mobutu they know is probably the one of the 70s and 80s and 90s, this sort of cartoonish Central African dictator with a leopard skin hat and fabulously corrupt. But he actually started out as Lumumba's protege. He was the junior partner in their relationship and sort of acted as Lumumba's secretary and doing errands for him. And he had served in the military for 6 or 7 years and was also a journalist. And he and Lumumba had sort of met in political circles in the capital, and they were great friends and allies. But as we can discuss later, that didn't last forever.
Right, right, certainly. So, did the foreign governments like the U.S. and the Soviet Union were they watching all this closely before independence actually occurred? Had they formed opinions of Mobutu and Lumumba?
Yeah, were they? I wouldn't. They maybe had one eye on the situation. I think the consensus was that no one was expecting a major crisis in Congo to happen. It had been this sort of sleepy Belgian colony where not much interesting politically was going on, and I don't think the U.S. or the Soviet Union expected much news to be coming out of there. But they were both forming opinions of Lumumba, and in a funny way, they sort of agreed, which was that so the Americans viewed him as this one U.S. official called him having weather vane tactics, where he just sort of saw where the political winds were blowing and changed his position. So he was seen as not entirely reliable or steadfast, just a political opportunist who would say anything or do anything that would get the most votes. And then the Soviets viewed him as unreliable. He was not someone who would be a firmly pro-Soviet leader at all. So both sides, in a way, viewed him as a bit of an unknown quantity and an unreliable potential ally.
Okay, okay, I see. So, by the time independence occurred, like the actual handover of power occurred, was he already? I guess there was going to be an election, but was he kind of like the identified head of the Congolese independence movement, or was
Yeah,
there still some doubt at that moment?
no. So independence was June 30th, 1960, and by then there had been parliamentary elections. Lumumba had won more votes than anyone else, and therefore was the one who formed a government and became prime minister. But yeah, on June 30th, Lumumba firmly in charge of Congo as prime minister.
Okay. Was it ultimately a peaceful transition like everybody was hoping for, or were there some bumps in the road, so to speak?
Well, for a few days, it was a peaceful transition that everyone was hoping for, but very, very quickly things went south. So the army mutinied. The army had been the colonial army, had had white Belgian officers and a black rank and file. As you can imagine, this was not particularly popular among the rank and file. So they mutinied just days after independence. Then two provinces seceded, in one right away, one a little later, and announced that they were no longer part of this new country. Lumumba called the white population was fleeing, and so the Belgian military sent in paratroopers all over the country, invading without permission from the Congolese. And so Lumumba's in this desperate situation where his country is falling apart before his very eyes. And he calls on the United Nations for help, not really even knowing what exactly they could do. But what they do is set up the biggest peacekeeping operation in history at that point. And they send eventually, I think, 15,000 peacekeepers to Congo. So it very quickly becomes this massive Cold War crisis, as I mentioned earlier, front page of the newspaper every day, and a place where the United Nations was sending in a multinational force and really staking its reputation on what happened.
Yeah, things just totally spiraled out of control. I mean, just shockingly quickly, I have to admit. And there were some moments. I mean, I don't know if I'd call it moments of levity, but I do recall a passage from your book where you mentioned that right after independence was gained, that the new government, the senior guys in the cabinet were spending a lot of time arguing over things like what the emblem should look like on the brand new passport, for
Right.
example, instead of like the absolutely much more serious high priority issues facing them.
Yeah,
Which
and I mean that's another theme of this story is so one, the new leaders were utterly unprepared. They were smart, talented politicians, but many of them, because the Belgians had so severely limited higher education, only very, very late did they allow Congolese to attend university, and not that many. You had a cabinet, a government of fairly uneducated people, uneducated by design of the Belgian administration.
Mhm.
you also had, it was just unwieldy politically because you had all these different ethnic groups, people representing this or that province. There were, I think, 23 different ministers. The idea being that, Lumumba could cobble together this massive coalition. So you had a really divided government with that was not loyal to one another, the various members. So as you say, yeah, they squabbled over things like the design of the emblem on the passport, what official order the motorcade should go in, things like that. And you know, meanwhile the country was falling apart.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but also these guys, like, I guess that they had not had any sort of experience in these crisis situations before because they were brand new. I mean, it was like their first week on the job, essentially. And so, I mean, they could have done, better in some ways, but also these were not like experienced old hands, at handling regional and national conflict, I'm sure.
Right. And I would put the emphasis, though, to be fair, on the extraordinary series of events. I mean, it's hard to imagine a leader who could have perfectly handled all that was thrown at him in the Congo, that was thrown at Lumumba. You have, just the mutiny, Belgian interference, the United Nations. It was an incredibly complex, fast moving situation. And you had a lot of nefarious actors trying to undermine the Congolese government. So
Oh, yeah,
the degree of difficulty was extremely high.
undoubtedly. So you mentioned Larry Devlin earlier. Can you talk about him? He was the station chief at the time all of this was happening. Like, what was his move into the CIA, for example?
Right. So he was a World War II veteran and then finished up college in California at San Diego State and then enrolled in a master's program at Harvard University. And one winter in about 1949, he was approached in this very old fashioned way, like we imagine it is and the way it is in the movies, approached by a visiting a professor of his, put him in touch with someone, a representative of the CIA, who, over in the academic offices of Harvard, asked him to join the CIA, and he did.
Would you like to see what it's like to work in the shadows, negotiate under duress, gather intelligence for your action cells, and participate in simulated battle? You can at Centurion Combat Simulation's next big event. You will operate in the dangerous Latin American country of Copan, where you either fight for equality as part of a socialist insurgency or work to stabilize and promote democracy in a US backed war. In this fully immersive world, you have the ability to change the course of history by fighting for your side as a soldier or spy. Centurion Combat Simulations games run for 46 hours over 3 days with embedded role players to guide you and your teammates. Centurion's next event is at the Arena Training Center in Blakely, Georgia from December 8th through December 10th, 2023. Centurion Combat Simulations is owned and operated by retired U.S. Special Operations combat veterans. Don't miss out on this amazing opportunity to immerse yourself and test yourself. Enlist now at joincenturion.com.
And at first, Devlin was posted to Europe, where his cover was non-official cover as a travel guide writer for Vodars, the great American travel guide series. And this was perfect cover for a spy because it allowed you to travel all around Europe, taking notes and taking photographs, and you had a great excuse for being in any country. And so this was his cover for a while, and then he switched to having what's called official cover, where was supposedly posted at the State Department, but actually worked for the CIA. And so he was in Brussels, the capital of Belgium, for a while, and then because of that experience, was made CIA station chief of Congo. But it's telling how unimportant the CIA and by extension the rest of the US government viewed the Congo in 1960 before independence, in that it posted this untested, relatively young CIA officer to the country because, as I said earlier, no one really expected much was going to happen there.
Right, right. He had like minimal staff. I think he was in his mid 30s at the time, if I recall correctly. And it was just, seems like a backwater posting for the most part until it isn't.
Right. And it really made his career, and he made extremely consequential decisions there, as it would turn out.
Would you describe him as a capable guy? I understand that it wasn't the highest priority posting, but was he someone who was able to accomplish what needed to be done once things really started to fall apart?
I would say it was undeniable that he was capable and action oriented. In retrospect, one can disagree with various decisions he made, as I
Sure, of course.
do in my book, but he was talented at his job, and was very good at developing sources and being in you know, getting to the right person, understanding how power worked in Leopoldville. On the other hand, I should say I think his view of Cold War rivalry at the time was not particularly sophisticated, and he was certainly not alone in that. But he viewed Soviet influence as extremely widespread and pernicious. When, in retrospect, we now know it was limited, and the Soviets didn't consider the Congo that important. So he was a very talented CIA officer, but I also think he got the Cold War wrong, as many did. He made decisions that I think were incorrect and ultimately immoral.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. That is one thing that surprised me reading through the book was it did seem like the Soviets kind of fumbled quite a bit with respect to the Congo. And, they have a reputation for being very, very good and very subtle when they need to be and able to, a vast reach. But it just did not seem like things worked out like they wanted them to in the Congo either. So everybody, the superpowers were all involved and it was not working out to anybody's satisfaction whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, the ironic thing is the at the time the US and other Western countries thought that Soviet influence was everywhere in Congo, and there was a conspiracy theory, for instance, that the mutiny was caused by communist infiltration, which there's no evidence that it was, and that would make no sense. Whereas the Soviets themselves sort of viewed Congo as this distant place where they didn't have much influence and it wasn't that important, that they could, score some propaganda points here and there. But the Americans didn't realize this at the time. They thought this was the Cold War battleground. They thought it somehow mattered, who what a Congolese government's view towards the Soviet Union was. So there was this real Cold War paranoia going on, which
Mhm.
I try and make it clear that this was what was motivating a lot of American behavior, while also pointing out that in retrospect, it was all quite overblown.
Yeah, yeah, amazing stuff. And one of the things that kind of made me laugh again in the book is I think that you mentioned at one point the Soviets sent a shipload of like food aid to the Congo, but it was a cargo hold full of bananas, which is one of the Congo's like biggest exports. So that's the last
Right.
thing that they need to be receiving from a foreign power is
Yeah,
bananas.
and they also sent wheat, but there were no mills in the Congo to
Yeah,
turn it into flour.
yeah,
There was this all people have said before that once during the Cold War, the Soviets sent snow plows to Guinea. I think the evidence doesn't back that up, but it's became such a Cold War chestnut because it demonstrated that the Soviets were not these master strategists in Africa. And certainly in 1960, that was also relatively early in the Cold War. They were less powerful than they would become. They
hmm
didn't have much of a power projection capability. So, for instance, they contributed to the UN airlift to Congo, just as the Americans and the British did, but they barely did, and their airlift capabilities were not particularly impressive.
hmm Yeah, yeah. So since you mentioned the UN, actually, that's perfect. I was just going to ask you, what was their involvement? You mentioned Secretary General Hammarskjöld earlier.
Mhm.
So can you talk about him a little bit? Because he was a fascinating character, and I learned more about him through your book than any other source I've read yet.
Yeah. So the United Nations in 1960 was called into Congo, a week after independence, roughly, when things are falling apart. Lumumba turns to the UN, sends a cable to Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General, requesting help. And Hammarskjöld made a decision there, which was that he would answer that call. And so there was a massive peacekeeping operation. It was a real experiment. Nothing like this had ever been done before. And so most of the troops were going to be fellow African troops from Ghana and Morocco and other countries across the continent. And they were sent in record time. And very quickly that operation just doesn't succeed in restoring order to Congo. So Dag Hammarskjöld, just to talk a little bit about him, he was a Swedish bureaucrat and diplomat who was, to everyone's surprise, including his own, his name was put forth to become Secretary General, which he did in 1953. And he was in many ways an odd choice for the job. He was somewhat obscure, as I mentioned. He was also a literary man. His hobbies involved translation, reading, writing, mountain climbing. He had all of these interests that were outside of diplomacy. And in particular, what was interesting was his style was just so different from Lumumba's. Lumumba was sort of volatile, active, blunt, and political, whereas Hammarskjöld was more diplomatic, understated, soft spoken, that sort of thing. And they really never got along, and there was deep misunderstanding between them.
Hmm. So, how much did that affect the ultimately like the UN operations in Congo? I mean, the personality conflict there at the very top.
I think it played a pretty big role. It should be mentioned though that there was a big substantive dispute as well, which was that the United Nations was not sending troops into the breakaway province of Katanga. Lumumba was incensed by this. He thought, the United Nations is here to restore order to the country, and they're not able to get into this one province, which is led by this sort of puppet leader for white interests there. Hammarskjöld, for his part, argued, if we sent the UN in, there'd be a massive war, and we can't do that. So this became this huge sticking point, and neither could really see the other's perspective. But Lumumba's relations with the UN went downhill quickly. It was partly with Hammarskjöld himself, but also with Ralph Bunche, who's another fascinating character we can talk
Yes,
about.
yes.
He was an American who worked for the UN as a high-level official at the UN and was Hammarskjöld's personal representative in Congo. And he met with Lumumba. He was also one of the most prominent African Americans in public life, Ralph Bunche was. And he met with Lumumba many times, and they grew so frustrated with each other. And Ralph Bunche's letters, I was able to read them in his archive of his papers, and they're just filled with invective. He's writing to his wife that Lumumba's schizophrenic. He says he called him a quote jungle demagogue. He really hated Lumumba, and
Wow.
the feeling was mutual.
Oh, wow. So ultimately, do you think that the UN goals there between Bunch and Hammarskjöld and the organization as a whole, was their goal to kind of prop up Lumumba's government because he was the prime minister, or was it to restore peace any way they could, or something in between?
Lumumba would have wished that it were to support his government, but the UN understandably saw its mandate as a bit different. It was empowered by the UN Security Council to, you know, see the Belgian military out of Congo, restore order, and they didn't answer to Lumumba's government. They answered to the Security Council. The troops in the UN operation answered. So that was a big source of dispute of who exactly were the UN peacekeepers working for. And so that was another aspect to the problem.
Yeah, there's a lot of players in the mix here with the Congo, like dead center of everything, unfortunately for them.
Yeah.
So at what point did the U.S. Devlin or the U.S. government back in D.C., did they start to think that Lumumba was about to fall into the Soviet camp? Was there any particular moment, anything he said or did that led to that?
Yeah, so there had been allegations before independence that he may have taken some amount of communist money. It's not entirely clear, but it's also possible. But he, as I mentioned, wasn't pro-communist by any sense of the word. But there were he issued statements appealing to Khrushchev to keep a careful eye on the situation, and then meanwhile he was also saying nice things about the United States. But then in August 1960, he, completely relations with Hammarskjöld are broken basically, and he sends a telegram to the Soviet Union asking for military aid. He meets with the Soviet ambassador, and this is seen as an unforgivable sin in the eyes of Washington. And so that really sets off alarm bells in the White House and the CIA, and a lot of actions would follow that.
Yeah, absolutely. So your book is called The Lumumba Plot. So obviously there was a plot against him. Can you talk a little bit about how that actually formed? Like at what point was he marked for death by anyone in this story?
Yeah, so it starts at the very top with President Eisenhower. On August 18th, 1960, there's this National Security Council meeting at the White House where Lumumba's latest antics are discussed and universally derided among the participants at the meeting. And we now know that it was at this meeting that Eisenhower said something, and the exact words are lost to history, but said something to the effect that Lumumba should be, you know, gotten rid of physically. And the note taker at the meeting would later testify that, he remembers this many years later and was told to keep this detail out of the notes that he was writing up. So it's very clear that Eisenhower sent a pretty strong signal in so many words that the CIA should get rid of Lumumba. He was looking at Alan Dulles, the CIA director, when he said these words. So Eisenhower has told Dulles, the head of the CIA, to do this. Dulles then gets to work, and a CIA chemist named Sidney Gottlieb actually is sent to Congo, flies to Congo with vials of poison that he instructs Larry Devlin, the CIA station chief, to put in Lumumba's food or toothpaste. So this is, it's like out of a science fiction or spy fiction movie where the CIA was so scared of Lumumba, so, worried that he would turn his country communist and allow the Soviets to take over what this country in the middle of Africa, that they actually tried to have him physically killed. And this all, much of this came out in 1975 with the Church Committee investigation. But there were also details I was able to fill in all these years later.
Amazing stuff. Amazing. Was this, Gottlieb and that whole program, they certainly deserve, their own book and have been the subject of many books. But was this the first time that they attempted to kill like a foreign leader with a, biological weapon?
Yeah. And it was, in fact, the first time they had tried to kill a foreign leader at all. At that point, the plots against Castro of Cuba were to embarrass him and not yet kill him, although those plots would come later. And so the one against Lumumba, that was a real watershed moment. And it was also unique in that it wasn't, some of these plans that later came out were sort of CIA ideas that overseers in the White House didn't know about or pretended not to know about, whereas this was at the direct instigation of the president. So that was one way in which was unique.
Did they have you mentioned that this toxin, obviously, but did they have a way of actually getting close enough to touch him, like physically touch him and get him to ingest it or inject it in him or whatever? Like, what was the actual plan to take him out? Do you know? Or
So,
does anybody know?
well, that turned out to be the problem in that Devlin was handed these poisons, but in the meantime, a lot had happened in Congo. Specifically, Lumumba had been overthrown as prime minister by the president of Congo, who fired him, and then Lumumba declared that he was firing him. And so there was this standoff. And into the void stepped Mobutu, who by that point was head of the army. And he took power in a coup and put Lumumba under house arrest. So when the order was given on August 18th, Lumumba was still in power. By the time the poison actually ended up in Congo in September, Lumumba was no longer in power and trapped in his house. And so Devlin tried and failed to find someone who had access to his house. He also suggested some other ways of killing Lumumba, saying that he requested a rifle so that someone could shoot him, various other methods. But none of those actually came to fruition. So the poison plot sort of fizzled out because it was, there was no way to get the poisons into Lumumba's mouth.
Okay. Yeah. So ultimately, he was not killed by the CIA. I mean, this story obviously has really kind of reverberated through history since then, but it fizzled out, like you mentioned. I do remember there's an amazing anecdote in the book. If you can help me recall the details, actually about two different guys on the CIA payroll who
Right.
unwittingly met each other at a hotel there and
Right.
didn't realize who each other was.
Yeah, it's one of these, if you wrote it in fiction, it would be seen as unbelievable. But the CIA, so Devlin's poisoning plot that he's in charge of is not no progress is happening. And we have the cables today, and you can see this. The headquarters is frustrated, saying, "Hey, what's the deal? Why is there no progress on this? What's up?" And so they send Devlin to two different men who are both, they have a lot in common. They're European criminals who had grown up in Paris and fought against the Nazis during World War II, and were sort of linked to the underworld of Europe and had been arrested for various things, and then recruited by the CIA. And they had been recruited by the CIA well before 1960, and but then sort of repurposed for this particular job. And so they were both sent to Congo, and they each proved to be more one than the other, sort of incompetent and unreliable and bumbling, and you know didn't end up achieving much so far as we can tell. But frustrating Devlin, who had to manage these sort of unmanageable characters. And yes, as you say, they both, neither knew about the other until they were at the same hotel and started talking to each other. And one of them was a little loose-lipped, and so these two supposedly clandestine agents ended up blowing their cover to one another.
So it honestly sounds like some kind of buddy action comedy setup. You know what I mean? It's really
Right.
amazing, and I know that nothing came of it, but it really is hard to imagine something like that until I read it in a book like yours. I'm like, wow, that actually happened. That is amazing.
Yeah,
And
and I
nobody
mean,
foresaw that happening either when they sent them there.
right, and we can talk about it in a minute, but even though the CIA did not manage to pull off this direct plot, they did have a role, and specifically Larry Devlin had a role in the events that led to Lumumba's death. And what I mean by that is a few things. So, as I mentioned, Lumumba is overthrown from power, fired as prime minister. That there was a CIA role in. They encouraged the president to fire Lumumba. They organized street protests where they paid protesters to protest against Lumumba, planted propaganda stories. Then, as I mentioned, Mobutu steps in and takes charge in a coup. The CIA had a role in that. It was bankrolling Mobutu. Devlin was meeting with him frequently. As Mobutu stays in power over the ensuing months, the CIA is funneling him cash, handing over briefcases of cash so that he can ostensibly pay his officers and stay in power. And then, long story short, Lumumba is thrown in jail. He tries to escape house arrest, gets caught, is thrown in a military prison, and then sent to a province where everyone knew he was going to die. And that is really where the CIA has the most blood on its hands, because Devlin learned that this transfer was about to happen. Mobutu and Mobutu's henchmen had told him, and Devlin had a lot of influence with this circle, and he decided not to use it and basically give a green light to Mobutu and his henchmen to send Lumumba away to his death. And indeed, hours after landing in the province of Katanga, he was killed. So it's not as clean a story, because the CIA, the poison didn't get in Lumumba's mouth, but the CIA did have a role, a very important role, in the events that led to Lumumba's assassination in January 1961.
Okay, yeah. And how did that happen exactly? It was like a firing squad, I think it was, if I recall correctly.
So the province there, Katanga, was a separatist province, as I mentioned, and the provincial governor there, or as he called himself, the president of independent Katanga, his forces killed Lumumba and Lumumba's fellow prisoners, and there were basically local Congolese soldiers acting under the orders of white Belgian officers who were acting at the behest of the provincial government there.
Okay, I see. There was some pretty sad, and I would even say despicable stuff that happened with his remains after that, which I also was not aware of until I read your book.
Yeah, I mean, his death was, it was really not just his death. He was tortured up until the point when he was shot.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as you say, after he was killed, he was buried, he was unburied, buried again, and then a final time, um, brought out of the ground, and then his body was dissolved in sulfuric acid. And my book opens, in fact, with Belgian police seizing the tooth of Lumumba, which the Belgian police officer who had been in charge of disposing the body kept Lumumba's tooth as a souvenir all these years later. And in 2016, it was finally seized by the Belgian government and then eventually returned to Lumumba's family, which is how my book ends.
Amazing. That's so horrible that that's all that you have remaining of your father. You can't go visit a gravesite or anything really like that, but you have a box, like a jewelry box, essentially left over,
Yeah.
and that's all there is.
Yeah.
It's very sad. So, what happened to Congo? What happened to Katanga after his death? I don't think everything worked out great for everyone there, did it?
Correct. So Katanga continues to be separate and not under control of the central government. And the UN finally in 1963, I think, sends in, has an operation that restores control and makes it so that it is formally part of the rest of Congo. And I should mention the same year Lumumba died, in September of that year, September of 61, Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General, died in a plane crash en route to negotiate a ceasefire in Congo. And so after his death, that sort of actually spurred progress in taking over Katanga. So that province is reintegrated by force by the UN. And then in 1965, only then does what was called the Congo crisis really end. And that was where Mobutu firmly takes charge and, with lots of American help, has put down various rebellions and finally is in charge. And then he had been the power behind the throne and not technically the president. And he then made himself the president in 1965. And then so officially begins his 30 plus years of leading the country, and which lasted until 1997.
1997. My gosh, that was not that long ago.
Right.
So, is it safe to say that ultimately the U.S. kind of accomplished its goals in the Congo? Did things work out in the way that we had wanted them to work out, with some caveats, I suppose?
Well, it's a great question, and there's sort of two different ways of looking at it. In extremely narrow Cold War terms, yeah, the United States got a great deal in Congo. They got rid of a person who was seen as potentially pro-Soviet, unreliable, unstable, and replaced him with this pro-American dictator, who would be on our side during the Cold War. So what was not to like? I think only in the narrowest of Cold War terms does that really make sense, because a few things. One, there was not much evidence that Lumumba was going to take the country in some pro-Soviet direction. I mean, he had cut his teeth fighting against the Belgian imperialists. He was not going to suddenly let some other country dominate his. And two, the Congolese people suffered so greatly for this. What you had was a country, a dictator propped up by the United States, who therefore didn't have to worry about being a popular leader and answering to his constituents. And so Congolese politics was completely distorted. There was a culture of bribery that began with the CIA bribing Mobutu, and the country was really run into the ground over 30 plus years. And so in 1997, Cold War was over, US aid declines, Mobutu's sort of fallen out of favor, and the country just outright implodes. And that kicks off one of the deadliest wars in recent memory, which was the Congolese civil wars of the 90s and early 2000s, which killed literally millions of people. And it was all a result of this extremely unstable, hollow regime just utterly collapsing.
Yeah, I don't recall his exact quote. Maybe you do, but didn't he say something at the very end that, like, the U.S. has abandoned me? They don't care about the Congo anymore. And you said that's exactly correct. That is exactly correct.
He was unusually self-aware at that moment. He said that I forget the exact words as well, but something like abandoned. I'm abandoned by the West, and they've discarded me. And he was right. He had served his Cold War purpose, and now is just sort of an embarrassment. He was denied a visa to visit Washington. That was the beginning of the end for him.
Well, so yeah, ultimately, I guess the people of the Congo suffered for all these machinations from these other foreign entities interfering.
Yeah, I mean, they had been victimized for 75 years by the Belgians, and then when they were finally independent, got victimized again, this time by Cold War competition, and in particular, I would argue, the actions of the United States.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned earlier that this kind of made Larry Devlin's career. What happened with him? Did he kind of reapply these lessons learned elsewhere afterwards?
Yeah, so he was sent to Laos to manage the CIA's secret war there. But then, interestingly, he was called back to the Congo, his old stomping grounds, in, I believe, 1967. So he left in 63, I think. And then, sorry, he was called back maybe in 65. I may have the dates wrong, but he was called back because basically no one else had as good a relationship with Mobutu. They had this intense relationship forged in the chaos of the Congo crisis, and were on very good terms with each other, called each other by their first names. And so Devlin is comes back to Congo, and then he's eventually promoted to be the branch chief for East Africa. But even then, he's constantly getting pulled back into Congo because no one else can deal with Mobutu like he can. He eventually retires from the agency in 74, I believe, and once again gets pulled back to the Congo. This time he's working for the Belgian American diamond merchant Maurice Templesman and being sort of his man in Congo. And again, it's because he has a great relationship with Mobutu. And in fact, American diplomats at the time who were in the country, which had then renamed itself to Zaire under Mobutu, American diplomats complained that Devlin, a retired CIA officer, had better access to Mobutu than they, he, the U.S. ambassador to Congo, to Zaire, did. He really retained quite a lot of influence with him.
Wow. That's impressive from a very narrow point of view, as you mentioned earlier, with the Cold War perspective.
Yeah.
So one final question here for you. Do you think that Lumumba had the potential to lead Congo to bigger and better things without, if you don't take into account any of the interference from the foreign powers, or was it kind of a doomed situation right from the start, regardless of what happened afterwards?
That's a great question. It's one I thought a lot about, and it's also sort of impossible to answer, but let me give you my best stab at it. Lumumba was far from perfect, as any reader of my book will hopefully come to understand. He was a great politician. I think at one point I say he was Congo's best politician and its worst statesman. So all the qualities that made him so popular and being able to, promise everything to everyone, be able to change positions so quickly, also made him not popular among Western leaders and Western governments. And so he was erratic. That is absolutely true. He was not, a source of constancy in the country. Let's just say that. On the other hand, as I mentioned, he was facing nearly insurmountable obstacles that any leader would have struggled with. So back to your question, I think it's likely that even without American meddling, Congo would not have had some nice, peaceful, happy post-independence period. It was, a lot of the problems of the country, even to this day, date back to Belgian colonialism, especially early on. As I mentioned, there was an underdeveloped political class that had been, denied education, denied the opportunity to advance, and that extended broadly across society. The economy was based on resource extraction. The institutions that the Belgians left behind were thin and weak. So there were all sorts of problems. It was a massive country with many divisions. It still is. So all those things would have been really hard for any leader to deal with. On the other hand, the post-independence decades that Congo experienced were so bad that it's really hard to imagine anything worse. And so had Lumumba been allowed to stay in power, or had he been allowed to return to power after being deposed, which was a thing that was a real possibility at the moment, there were various negotiations for this, I'm quite confident saying that whatever happened, it probably would have been better than what did happen, because you had 30 plus years of dictatorship, repression, poverty, conflict that ended in a massive civil war. So it really, the counterfactual doesn't have to be all that much better to be better than that.
Yeah, I totally understand. But whoever was in that position, they certainly had their work cut out for them, regardless of interference from foreign powers.
Indeed.
Okay, wonderful. Well, Stuart, this has been fascinating. I really love this book. For the listeners out there, honestly, we've covered about 20% of the book in this discussion so far. It's what it feels like. It's so in depth, and there's such a big cast of characters that we barely got to cover, like Ralph Bunche, for example, and some of the Soviets. Very, very interesting stuff. If you want to know about these conflicts in Africa in the 1960s, which is certainly a topic of interest to me, so make sure that you pick it up. The book is called Lumumba Plot by Stuart Reid, and it will be out very soon. Is that right, Stuart? It's coming out
October 17th.
October 2nd. Okay, great. So by the time you're listening to this, the book is out or about to come out. Anyway, so make sure that you pick it up. I thoroughly enjoyed it, as I mentioned. Stuart, what are you working on now that the book is published? Do you have another one that you're working on, or are you just
I
taking a
do
break for a
not.
moment?
I'm enjoying not working on a book. It was a great process. It was, my wife is very happy that I'm not working on a book right now. So I'm just trying to enjoy the post publication euphoria and not get to work on anything yet.
Great, great. Do you have a project in mind at the very least, or are you kind of keeping that under wraps for the time being?
I honestly do not have any particular project in mind. I'm
Oh, okay.
I'm just trying to get through seeing this to publication, and then we'll see. But I loved writing a book. It was so fun and so rewarding, and so I would love to do another one at some point.
Great, great, great. Well, it was a pleasure for me to read as well. It took me a lot less time to read it than it took you to write it, but I certainly appreciate your efforts.
Well, thank you so much for reading it, and thanks for having me on. This is really fun to talk about the
Good,
book.
good. So, is there anywhere that people can connect with you online? Do you have like a social media profile, a public profile, anything like that that you can share?
Sure. So my website is stuartareid.com, stuartareid.com. And that's also my Twitter handle. So you can look me up there. And yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, Stuart A. Reid. All right. Well, thank you, Stuart. This has been a real pleasure. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take care. Don't forget to download the prologue and first chapter of the Lumumba plot for free using the link in the show notes of this episode. And if you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.